Welcome to Insomnia Nights, where sleep drifts and nightmares begin. I never thought I'd find myself driving down a narrow dirt road that seemed to vanish into an ocean of pine trees. The GPS signal had already flickered out miles back, and by the time I reached the turnoff to the fire lookout, the world had narrowed to just the path ahead, flanked by towering trunks that rose like ancient sentinels. The smell of wet pine and earth clung to the air, and each breath carried the faint, metallic temps of old machinery. My tires crunched over gravel, a sound so sharp it felt deafening against the unnatural silence of the forest. The tower appeared, slowly through a break in the trees, like a vertical shadow stitched into the landscape. It leaned slightly, a weathered silhouette of steel and wood, its paint faded to a grey that might have once been green. From a distance, it seemed abandoned, yet there was a presence about it, a subtle vibration in the air that made the hairs along my neck stand on end. As I parked, a loose branch snapped under my foot, a tiny noise that seemed to echo far longer than it should have. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying the whisper of leaves like a warning. I hesitated at the base of the ladder leading up to the lookout. The wood groaned under my weight as I climbed, the creak of each rung amplifying the suspense in my chest. By the time I reached the small landing at the top, the wind had fallen again, leaving only the soft, persistent hum of the forest surrounding me. From up here, the trees stretched endlessly, an unbroken sea of dark green, each shadow a potential threat. Sunlight filtered weakly through the branches, casting long, wavering patterns across the metal floor of the tower. Inside, the air was cooler, carrying the faint scent of rust and oil, a reminder of the tools and machinery long left to age. Dust motes floated lazily in the shafts of light, and I could hear the faint creak of the buildings settling, though it sounded almost like deliberate movement, like the tower itself was breathing. Against the far wall stood a man, stocky and worn, his hands gripping the edge of a small desk where a collection of logbooks lay. His face was lined, the kind of lines only drawn from years spent watching and waiting in solitude. "Welcome," he said, his voice low, deliberate. "I'm Harris. You'll be staying up here for a while, I take it." I nodded, my own voice strangled by the heaviness in the air. There was a peculiar tension to him, a subtle alertness that hinted at experience beyond the ordinary. His eyes scanned the forest through the narrow windows, sharp and calculating, and then returned to me with a flicker of warning. "Rules," he said finally, leaning back against the desk with a sigh that seemed too heavy for the morning. "There are rules here, things that must never be ignored." I felt my stomach tighten. "Rules?" Harris's gaze didn't waver. "You'll learn soon enough. They're simple to remember, but if you break them, well, let's just say the forest has its ways of correcting mistakes." I wanted to laugh, to brush it off as veteran superstition, but the look in his eyes, and the stillness around us, told me otherwise. The forest seemed to lean closer, listening. Even the birds were quiet. He handed me a folded sheet of paper, edges frayed and corners curled. "First night, you get this. Read it carefully. Learn it. Don't stray from it." I unfolded it, and there it was, a list of warnings, each written in precise, urgent lettering. Never leave the tower after dark. Never answer the whispers. Never ignore the signs. The words seemed almost alive, pulsating faintly on the page. As I read them, I tried to ignore the shiver that ran through me, attributing it to nerves and exhaustion from the drive. Yet even as I looked up, the shadows at the edges of the window seemed to shift. A subtle movement, something just beyond the corner of my vision, coaxed my curiosity and fear in equal measure. We spent the next hour walking through the tower together. Harris showed me the rudimentary kitchen, the supply of canned food, the radio that never seemed to pick up more than static, and the narrow bed tucked into the far corner. Every detail of the place spoke of long-term isolation, the scratched marks on the floor from boots, the faded stains on the metal table, the small hand-carved charms nailed to beams in corners as though to ward off something unseen. Outside, the forest stretched endlessly, the trees forming a labyrinth of green and shadow. Even in daylight, it was suffocating, and I felt a creeping sensation of being watched. Small sounds punctuated the silence, a branch snapping in the distance, a bird call to shrill and sudden, the rustle of leaves in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. Harris noticed my unease, but said nothing. Instead, he handed me a flashlight and a small notebook. "Log everything," he said simply. "Even if it seems trivial, nothing is trivial here." That evening, as the sun sank, Lower, behind the endless canopy, the forest transformed. Shadows lengthened and darkened, pooling around the base of the tower, creating shapes that my mind tried to dismiss as tricks of the light. The wind picked up, carrying scents that were not entirely natural, the faint, coppery temps of blood, the mustiness of decay, and something else, something sweet and pungent that made my stomach churn. I climbed the ladder one last time before nightfall, pausing at the top to take in the view. The horizon seemed to ripple, like the forest itself was breathing, stretching and contracting. My pulse quickened. Harris's words echoed in my head, "Never leave the tower after dark." And yet, as darkness settled, I realized I hadn't even heard the first whisper yet. Not the one the rules warned about, not the subtle hissing that might come from the trees themselves, but in the stillness, in that suffocating quiet, I understood. This forest was alive, and I was being watched from the moment I arrived. By the time the first stars appeared overhead, twinkling faintly through the canopy, I felt a presence brushing the edges of my consciousness, not tangible, not fully visible, but undeniably there. It was patient, calculating, waiting, and I knew, deep down, that following the rules wasn't just advice, it was survival. The night fell fully, and the first real sense of isolation settled over me. The tower groaned in the wind, shadows shifted like liquid, and the air grew colder, heavier. Somewhere in the forest, a branch snapped sharply, the sound carrying farther than it should have. I wasn't alone up here, and I was beginning to understand that Harris's warnings were far from empty. I wrote my first log entry hesitantly, hands trembling, trying to record everything: the sights, the smells, the sense of oppressive stillness. And as I wrote, I swore I heard a faint whisper, just at the edge of hearing, carrying a single word that I couldn't quite make out. My heart thudded in my chest, a warning of things to come. I didn't sleep that night, not really. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring out into the dark expanse of the forest, listening to the wind, to the subtle creaks of the tower, to the faint, almost imperceptible rustling in the distance. Every sound carried meaning, every shadow hinted at danger, and I felt, with a creeping certainty, that my first night at the lookout was only the beginning. The morning after my arrival, the forest felt different. The wind was quieter, almost hesitant, and even the sunlight filtering through the canopy seemed cautious, spilling thin, uneven streaks across the tower floor. Harris was already awake, moving with the fluid precision of someone who had spent decades alone in this space. He handed me a mug of bitter coffee without speaking, his eyes scanning the horizon as though it might shift between sips. I unfolded the sheet of rules again, feeling the weight of their importance pressing down on me. They weren't just guidelines, they were laws of survival. Harris watched silently as I studied each one. "Memorize them," he said finally, his voice low and deliberate. "Everything else is secondary. The forest doesn't forgive mistakes." The rules themselves seemed simple at first glance. Never leave the tower after dark. Never answer the whispers. Never ignore the signs. Keep a constant log. Do not trust the shadows. But the simplicity was deceptive. Each one carried consequences that Harris didn't need to explain. I could feel them in the air, like static electricity crawling along my skin. I spent the morning exploring the tower and its immediate surroundings. The metal floors and rickety railings creaked underfoot, each sound amplified by the silence beyond. Small signs of past volunteers were scattered throughout, faded bootprints in the dust, a cracked compass, a journal left open on a desk with a single line written repeatedly, "Do not look behind." Harris explained that every volunteer experienced the forest differently. Some were lucky, some weren't. The rules, he said, aren't suggestions, they're contracts. The forest enforces them, and it adapts. The more careless you are, the smarter it gets. The first anomaly appeared mid-morning. A bird, black as ink, circled the tower several times before vanishing into the trees. I noticed its flight pattern, deliberate, almost mechanical, as if it was observing my every movement. The hairs on my neck rose, and I remembered Rule 2. Never answered the whispers. There hadn't been a whisper yet, but the weight of anticipation settled over me like a stone. By afternoon I tried to focus on mundane tasks, logging supplies, cleaning the small kitchen, organizing the radio. But the forest pressed in on all sides. Shadows shifted in ways that didn't match the sun. Branches seemed to curl toward me, and the faintest rustling of leaves carried messages my mind couldn't fully decode. Harris joined me for a moment near the edge of the tower. "It watches everything," he said. "You'll start hearing things soon. That's normal. Don't respond. Just record. Observe. Survive." The first whisper came as evening approached. I was rearranging cans when I heard it. A faint hiss, almost blending with the wind. My heart skipped a beat. It seemed to come from all directions at once. I froze, trying to convince myself it was nothing. "Do not answer," I reminded myself, gripping the edge of the counter. The whisper became a little clearer, forming a single, elongated syllable. My throat went dry. The instinct to respond, to call out, rose sharply. I resisted. I didn't speak. The forest seemed to sigh in response, a heavy, deliberate sound that rattled the tower. The shadows outside stretched and twisted, elongating unnaturally. I felt a presence near the corner of my vision, shifting, waiting, and then it was gone. Harris didn't react when I told him. "Good," he said quietly. "Many fail that first test. You passed. For now." Night fell slowly, draping the forest in black velvet. The wind picked up, carrying distant noises, the cracking of branches, the far-off howl of an unseen animal, and the faint whisper, returning in fragments. I followed Harris's advice. Write everything down. My hands shook as I recorded details of the sounds, the smells, the temperature change, the way shadows seemed to pulse with life. By midnight, I understood the true weight of the rules. They weren't just words. They were survival tools in a forest that was alive, intelligent, and patient. I realized that the forest didn't just respond to action. It studied, adapted, and remembered. And for the first time, I felt that subtle, creeping dread that I would soon test my limits. The first day ended with a chilling realization. The forest didn't care about excuses. It didn't reward effort, skill, or courage. It only enforced rules. And I had already learned the first of many lessons. Obedience was the only path to safety. The first night settled like a weight over the forest, thick and suffocating, the kind that makes every rustle, every distant snap, feel amplified. I sat near the edge of the lookout's small deck, wrapped in a threadbare blanket Harris had lent me, staring at the infinite wall of trees that seemed to absorb the fading light. Even the wind sounded different here, not the gentle sigh I'd known in other forests, but a low, almost deliberate moan that seemed to creep through the tower's structure and into my chest. The shadows were the first thing I noticed. Or maybe, the shadows were always there and only now I had the attention to see them. They clung to the tree line, elongated by the dim glow of the lantern I had lit inside the tower. At first, I rationalized them as mere trickery of the light, but the more I observed, the more the shapes seemed to pulse, to sway as though they were alive. My pulse quickened at each flicker, each small movement that shouldn't have been there. Then came the scratching. At first, subtle, almost polite, a soft scrape against the tower's wooden supports. I froze, listening as the sound repeated, this time closer, more deliberate, running along the metal brackets and the boards beneath my feet. I told myself it was an animal, a raccoon perhaps, though I knew raccoons didn't usually scale towers with such care, nor did they pause to listen, as if aware I was listening back. The hairs on my arms stood up, prickling with the kind of fear that is both cold and tight, like icy fingers curling round your spine. I tried to distract myself, repeating Harris's rules in my head. Never leave the tower after dark. Never answer the whispers. Never ignore the warning signs. The words felt protective, a lifeline I could cling to, and yet they also carried a weight that pressed against my skull. I had obeyed so far, yet the forest already seemed to test the boundaries of my vigilance. A shadow detached itself from the tree line, sliding silently between the gaps in the underbrush. It was too fast, too fluid, moving with an intelligence that no animal I had ever seen possessed. I could feel its gaze, if such a thing could be said to exist, boring into me from the darkness, and I ducked instinctively behind the deck railing, heart hammering like a war drum. The whispers began again, low and sibilant, curling around the edges of my awareness. I couldn't make out the words, though I could swear they were speaking to me directly, coaxing, beckoning. I clenched my jaw and tried to remind myself of the rule: never answer the whispers. I had no intention of responding, yet my mind, like a traitorous ally, started to form silent replies, imagining what I would say if I dared. The thought alone made my stomach twist. Halfway through the night, a local hiker appeared, materializing from the tree line as if conjured from the shadows themselves. His presence was unnerving. Even his steps seemed muted, almost inhumanly quiet. "You need to stay strictly to the rules," he said, voice hoarse but urgent, eyes darting nervously toward the forest. "They notice if you falter, if you let curiosity take hold. You'll regret it." Before I could respond, he vanished, swallowed whole by the darkness, leaving only the echo of his warning and a lingering scent of wet earth and smoke. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the lookout, every groan of the metal frame, sounded like a warning. I tried to focus on mundane tasks, checking the fire extinguisher, logging the temperature and wind direction, inspecting the lanterns, anything to anchor myself. But even these actions felt undercut by the forest's presence, an oppressive awareness that I was no longer alone. By the time the first grey light of dawn seeped through the pines, I was trembling, my body cold and exhausted, my mind buzzing with the memory of whispers and shadows that refused to be rationalized away. The forest seemed calm now, deceptively so, as if it had been watching me sleep, and I knew that this night was only the beginning. The rules, Harris's whispered warnings, were no longer abstract. They were essential. They were survival. And yet, even as the sun climbed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had already marked me, that the forest would remember my fear and come back for it when darkness fell again. Curiosity has a way of poisoning caution, even when you know the cost. By the fourth night, the oppressive silence of the forest had begun to gnaw at me. Each flicker of shadow, each whisper in the distance, drew me toward the edge of the lookout like a moth circling a flame. I knew the rule, Harris's solemn words echoing in my mind, "Never leave the tower after dark." And yet, that night, I found myself climbing down the narrow, creaking ladder before my rational mind could stop me. The forest greeted me like a living entity, cool and damp against my skin. The scent of pine and rotting leaves filled my lungs, mingling with something acrid I couldn't name, something that made my stomach churn. Every step into the undergrowth felt deliberate, as if the forest itself were guiding me, bending shadows and rustling branches to lure me further from safety. I noticed immediately that things were not as they should be. The trees, gnarled, impossibly tall, seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, subtly moving their trunks to block paths I had thought clear. A low hum vibrated in the air, almost imperceptible, but enough to make my teeth chatter. And then I heard it, a soft, beckoning voice calling my name. "Come, come closer." I froze, telling myself it was the wind, a trick of my exhausted mind. But the voice persisted, intimate and persuasive, each syllable curling around my thoughts. Against every instinct, against the rules that had been drilled into me, I took another step, and then another. The ground underfoot became treacherous, slick with moss and hidden roots. My fingers brushed against the bark of trees that seemed to pulse beneath my touch, as though the forest itself were alive, aware of my trespass. A sudden rustle in the underbrush made me spin, only to find nothing, yet the feeling of being watched, of being stalked, was undeniable. I stumbled into a small clearing and stopped, heart hammering. Shadows pooled at the edges, moving independently of any light source, coalescing into forms vaguely humanoid. I realized with a cold certainty that they were observing me, studying me, learning, and the voice came again, closer this time, urging me forward. Panic flared, and I turned to run, back toward the ladder, toward safety, but the forest had changed. Paths I had memorized now, twisted and warped before me. Trees leaned in, branches scraping my arms and face like long, thin fingers. The voice followed, omnipresent, echoing from multiple directions, impossible to pinpoint. "Stay," it whispered, and then, more urgently, "or leave." The contradiction made my mind reel. By some miracle, I spotted the ladder leading back to the lookout, partially obscured by the shadows. I ran, nearly falling several times on the slick roots and rocks. The air was cold and sharp, biting my skin, and the forest seemed to pulse around me, shifting and bending to disorient, to trap. Every time I glanced behind, I saw silhouettes moving, mimicking my every motion, never quite human, never quite animal. I reached the ladder and scrambled up, hands raw against the splintering wood. Behind me, the forest fell silent, unnaturally silent, as if holding its breath, waiting. Inside the tower, I collapsed against the door, shaking, sweat and tears mingling on my face. The lanterns flickered violently, casting long, jagged shadows that crawled across the walls. Harris's voice came to me in memory, stern and unwavering. Rules are not suggestions, they are survival. I had broken the first rule, and the consequences were immediate, visceral. My heart pounded as I pressed myself against the wall, listening to the silence outside. The forest had let me return this time, but I knew it had, observed, remembered, and would act again, more cunningly, more violently. The next time my curiosity overcame me, I spent the rest of the night awake, gripping the blanket, feeling the forest's eyes on me from the tree line. Each whisper, each scrape, each shadow felt like a promise of the price I had already paid. And in the back of my mind, a single, terrifying thought took root. The forest was not just a backdrop. It was an active, intelligent predator, and breaking a rule was not just reckless, it was a signal, a mark. By dawn, I understood something I had only feared before. The rules existed for a reason far beyond mere protocol. They were the boundary between life and whatever waited in the shadows, and I had crossed it. I should have known better. The warnings were clear. The marks, the whispers, Harris's cautions, everything screamed for restraint. But curiosity, or perhaps some foolish defiance, overpowered my reason. The forest had been whispering to me for hours, soft syllables at first, barely audible, curling around my ears like smoke. And then it formed words, my name, calling me deeper into the tree line. I hesitated at the edge of the clearing, my hands trembling. The rules echoed in my mind. Never answer whispers. I had broken one rule already, but this felt different. This was direct, personal. The temptation was unbearable. My rational mind screamed to stay in the tower, but the voice was persistent, intimate, and strangely coaxing. I whispered back, almost involuntarily, "Who's there?" The forest fell silent for a heartbeat, an unnatural pause that pressed against my chest. Then the reaction was instantaneous. Branches lashed at me like the whip of some living thing, tangling in my hair and scratching my arms. Leaves and debris flew as if caught in a violent storm, yet the air was eerily still. Shadows shifted around me, coalescing into shapes that mimicked the forms of people I knew, volunteers I had met during my first days at the lookout, some of whom had already disappeared. Panic surged. I bolted toward the tower, heart hammering, limbs trembling. Every step felt heavier, as the forest itself seemed to resist me. Roots tangled at my feet, branches reached to grasp me, and the whispers, now a cacophony, screamed in my ears, repeating my name, mocking me, filling me with nausea and fear. When I reached the tower, I found Harris already at the door, face pale, eyes wide with horror. "You answered," he said, his voice shaking. "You've drawn it." I didn't need explanation. The shadows had followed me. Outside the window, I saw them move in ways no natural creature could, bending, stretching, twisting. They had learned the boundaries, mimicking human gestures, and now, perhaps, testing my resolve. Inside, it became clear that one of the side characters I had come to trust, a fellow volunteer named Lorna, had been taken. One moment, she had been helping me organize supplies. The next, she was gone, leaving behind only an empty space and a faint, lingering scent of damp soil and something fouled beneath it. I searched frantically, calling her name, but the forest swallowed my voice, echoing it back as a distorted, mocking whisper. Harris grabbed my arm. "It's adaptive," he hissed. "It learns from fear, from mistakes. Every time you break a rule, it becomes more capable. You cannot let it manipulate you like this." I forced myself to breathe, trying to ignore the sensation of hands brushing my skin from unseen sources. My hair stood on end as the room temperature seemed to drop drastically, each breath visible as mist. I checked every corner, every closet, the small storage spaces, but the shadows had disappeared just as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving only an oppressive darkness and the faint echo of footsteps retreating into the forest. That night, I tried to document everything. I wrote down the events in meticulous detail, hoping to find a pattern or clue, some way to understand the entity's logic. But as I wrote, I noticed the words on the paper shifting subtly, letters blurred, then reformed into phrases I had not written. Do not answer, do not follow. Sleep became impossible. Every noise, every shadow outside the tower, every creak of the wooden beams overhead seemed amplified. The whispers never ceased, curling through the corners of my mind even when I tried to focus on mundane tasks. I felt as if the entity were inside my head, probing my thoughts, anticipating my fears. Harris attempted to guide me through a meditation of sorts, instructing me to ground myself in the tower's structure, to remember the rules, and to ignore the voices, but it was futile. The forest had already begun rewriting the game. It tested my patience, my sanity, my very perception of reality. By midnight, the terror escalated further. A flickering shadow appeared at the window, taking the shape of Lorna, smiling at me, her eyes empty. She mouthed something, but I refused to respond, trembling, heart in my throat. The entity adapted again. Now it wasn't merely a shadow. It was capable of mimicry, deceit, emotional manipulation. I could hear her voice, soft and pleading, whispering my name, trying to lure me outside. I forced myself to look away. I concentrated on the tower, on the metal and wood under my hands, on the cool metallic smell that was strangely grounding. I whispered the rules aloud, over and over. Never leave after dark, never answer whispers, never ignore warning signs. Saying them aloud, I felt a tenuous shield form around me, as if the structure itself recognized my obedience. Still, the night dragged on, relentless. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadows moving, the humanoid shapes flickering at the edge of vision. I felt the forest's presence pressing in, weighing down on me with a gravity that had nothing to do with mass. I could sense its intelligence. It was learning, strategizing, shaping the environment to unnerve me, to weaken my resolve. At one point, I ventured to the edge of the tower platform, peering into the black void below. The forest stretched, endlessly, dark and shifting. I noticed a figure moving with precision, stepping over roots and stones as if it knew every path I had traveled. It paused and tilted its head, almost inquisitively, as if to ask, "Will you obey now?" I backed inside, slamming the door, my body trembling violently. I realized with dread that answering the whisper had consequences far beyond my imagination. It was not punishment in the conventional sense. It was a lesson in fear, a reminder that curiosity could kill. And it was adaptive. It would remember this, and the next transgression would be even more personal, even more devastating. Harris stayed close, silent but vigilant. He did not scold me further. He knew, as I did, that shame was irrelevant here. Survival depended on precision, on obedience, and on the ability to anticipate the forest's intelligence without letting it penetrate your mind. As dawn broke, bringing pale, filtered light through the trees, the shadows finally receded. The whispers quieted, leaving only an oppressive memory of their presence. Lorna was gone. Irretrievably, another mark of the forest's relentless adaptation. I was left with a sharpened understanding. Breaking the second rule had cost a life, taught the forest about my weaknesses, and placed me squarely in its sights. The tower, once a sanctuary, now felt precarious. Every creak, every wind gust, every subtle shift in the shadows reminded me that the entity was learning, evolving. I could survive, but only by following the rules to the letter, and by anticipating that each new step, each new day, would bring a test far more cunning than the last. As I lay awake, listening to the forest breathe and the faint remnants of Lorna's whispered voice still echoing in my mind, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: the rules were not suggestions, they were survival. And survival here would demand vigilance, cunning, and obedience I was only beginning to comprehend. The forest no longer felt passive. It was awake in a way that gnawed at the edges of my mind. Each morning, the sunlight that filtered through the canopy seemed hesitant, flickering as though afraid to touch the forest floor. Every shadow was longer, every gust of wind deliberate, carrying a faint murmur that could almost, but never fully, be made sense of. The rules were now etched into my consciousness, repeated silently like a mantra. Never leave after dark, never answer whispers, never ignore warning signs. I began to notice subtle distortions around the tower. The path I had memorized since my arrival seemed slightly longer each day, as if the trees had shifted overnight. Fallen logs appeared in new places. Rocks rearranged themselves. My map of the forest, drawn with painstaking care, became unreliable almost instantly. I could no longer trust distance or direction, and the feeling of being watched pressed down on me like humidity in a storm. The shadows had learned patience. They no longer rushed me with sudden movement but lingered just beyond the periphery of vision, teasing, observing, waiting for me to falter. I caught glimpses of shapes between trees, indistinct at first, then increasingly humanoid. Sometimes they mirrored my movements, paused when I paused, and yet vanished if I tried to approach. Other times, they seemed entirely separate, moving with a deliberate intelligence, a calculation that chilled me more than any physical threat could. I found remnants of old volunteers' notes, tucked into corners of the tower, scraps of paper, filled with frantic handwriting, diagrams of the forest, and cryptic symbols. They all conveyed the same essential message. The forest had a mind. It reacted to every action, every thought, every violation of the rules. Some pages were covered in blotches of ink or blood, perhaps both, leaving their warnings almost illegible. One entry stood out. It was written by someone named Carmichael, a volunteer who had served decades before my arrival. His handwriting wavered as though under duress. It knows what you fear. It waits. It tests. One rule broken is a lesson. More, and you vanish. Do not trust the shapes. Do not follow the voice. Survive by the rules alone. I read it over and over, feeling a bitter kinship with someone who had clearly suffered, and possibly failed. In the same ways I was now confronting, the forest began to invade my senses in ways that words struggled to convey. The air carried subtle scents of decay and wet earth, even though I knew nothing had died nearby. Leaves rustled in precise rhythms that suggested deliberate intent, forming patterns almost readable if one stared long enough. Birds would call, but their songs were slightly wrong, rising and falling in unnatural sequences. I started noticing these distortions before the shadows appeared, a prelude to their presence, a signal that the forest was actively anticipating my thoughts. Harris and I spoke little, both of us learning to navigate the tower with quiet efficiency. Words were often unnecessary. Actions, careful movements, and adherence to the rules were the true language of survival. But even silence could be corrupted. Once, as I moved to the pantry, I thought I heard Harris calling my name. I froze, pulse hammering. The voice repeated, soft and insistent. I did not answer. When I looked up, he was standing beside me, unmoving. The voice had been a mimic. The forest had learned not just to manipulate space, but to exploit trust, bending reality to unsettle my mind. At times, the forest seemed almost playful, like a predator toying with its prey. I would wake to find objects rearranged in the tower, jars shifted on shelves, knives repositioned on the counter, a blanket tossed to the floor. No human hand had moved them, and yet the changes were deliberate, taunting, as if the forest were reminding me that it was aware of my every action. Sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford. I lay in the tower at night, eyes wide, listening to every minute's shift, the brushing of leaves against wood, the faint scuff of something too large for the underbrush, whispers that never formed words. The terror was not sudden or violent. It was creeping, a constant pressure that slowly eroded my sense of certainty. Reality itself became suspect. Sometimes I caught glimpses of shapes moving in impossible ways. A figure would appear at the edge of a clearing, then blink, and I would find it perched high in a tree where no human could balance. Another would be reflected in a pane of glass, its motion deliberately offset from my own, a cruel echo. I realized I could not trust sight alone. The forest had learned to distort perception, feeding paranoia and doubt. Harris attempted to guide me through the night. He showed me small techniques to maintain orientation and focus, counting steps, touching the metal structure of the tower, marking the floorboards with chalk. These rituals were grounding, a way to anchor myself in something tangible, while the forest toyed with my mind. And yet, even these methods offered only partial relief. I noticed chalk marks subtly shifted, lines that had been straight, now curving unnaturally, reminding me that even the tower, my sanctuary, could not be taken for granted. The creeping horror was not only psychological, it had tangible consequences. Supplies would vanish, sometimes only to reappear far from where I had left them. Equipment was subtly damaged, tools dulled or broken, ropes frayed without explanation. Harris and I began rationing, protecting, and double-checking everything. Even small mistakes, failing to lock a door correctly, misplacing a tool, were punished with shadows hovering closer, whispers growing more insistent. The forest had learned precision as well as fear. I began to notice patterns in the shadows, behavior. They avoided direct sunlight, but within the tower's shadows, they could linger indefinitely. They seemed drawn to my fears, reacting most strongly when I felt isolated or anxious. Yet, when I forced myself to act with calm deliberation, when I followed the rules perfectly, Their movements slowed, as though they respected, or perhaps feared, order. This understanding became a lifeline. If the entity learned from mistakes, my only chance was to act with absolute discipline. And still, there were moments when the forest defied logic. A path I had walked the previous day would twist into impossibility. A familiar tree would appear taller, thicker, or strangely hollowed. The air would thicken as if compressed, and the sounds of the forest would warp, birds cawing in odd sequences, twigs snapping in no discernible order. I understood that my mind was being challenged as much as my body. Survival required not only obedience but mental fortitude, the ability to discern reality from trickery, and the patience to wait while the forest tested my resolve. By the end of the week, the creeping horror had become a constant companion. I moved through the tower and its surroundings with meticulous care, watching every shadow, listening to every sound, checking and double-checking every rule. Harris and I spoke of contingency plans in whispers, sketching escape routes that might no longer exist, discussing precautions against an entity that could predict every move. Even then, a persistent unease lingered. The forest was learning, adapting, and preparing. I realized that the horror was no longer merely external. It had seeped into my consciousness. Dreams became indistinguishable from reality. When I closed my eyes, I saw the shifting shapes, the elongated shadows, and the patterns of the forest, all moving with intent. In waking moments, I questioned the solidity of the tower, the permanence of the trees, and even the reliability of my own thoughts. I had become both observer and prey, caught in a game I had barely begun to understand, and yet, amidst the creeping dread, I held on to one fragile truth: order, discipline, and the rules were my only weapons. I could survive, perhaps, but only if I respected the intelligence I had provoked. The forest was alive, and it knew me. It watched me, learned me, adapted to me. Each day was a test, each night a crucible, and I was only beginning to see the edges of the labyrinth in which I was trapped. In the creeping horror of the forest, clarity emerged. Survival was not a matter of courage alone. It was a matter of obedience, patience, and the relentless application of the rules. And even then, I understood that the forest would continue to evolve, and I would need to evolve with it, or be consumed entirely. Dawn arrived with a deceptive serenity. The first streaks of sunlight through the treetops made the forest seem calm, even inviting. But I knew better. The night had left its imprint, a subtle shift in the air, a lingering sense that the forest itself was watching, and that I had drawn attention I could not yet comprehend. I stepped outside the tower cautiously, noticing immediately that small changes had occurred. A chair that I was certain I had left beside the desk was now at an odd angle, facing the window. A set of my personal notes lay scattered on the floor, some pages smudged as if damp, others bearing marks I didn't recognize, scratches along the margins, symbols I could not decipher. My stomach churned. Harris arrived shortly after, his gait slow and deliberate. He observed my discomfort with an almost clinical detachment. "You saw it then," he said, not waiting for me to explain. His eyes, sharp beneath the brim of his hat, flicked toward the tree line. "It's testing. You learning. Every mistake, every curiosity, it remembers." I wanted to ask what he meant, but the words caught in my throat. My ears had started picking up the subtle irregularities in the forest, a bird call that repeated endlessly in the same pitch, a rustling of leaves that seemed to come from nowhere, the faint echo of footsteps that stopped as soon as I turned to face them. The forest was alive with signs, all pointing to something deliberate, something intelligent. Over the next hours, the manifestations escalated. I found a cooking pot in the tower's corner that I had left clean. It now contained a thin, dark liquid that smelled of iron and decay. I set it outside, but it reappeared inside moments later. The pattern was unnerving. Objects moved, not randomly, but as if guided by intent. I could sense a presence learning my habits, observing my responses, cataloging my fears. Harris warned me again about the rules. "This isn't just superstition," he said. "Every volunteer who's crossed a line left signs, marks, notes, warnings. The forest will escalate, but you can survive if you respect its boundaries. Ignore them, and it adapts. That's the danger." I tried to follow his advice, meticulously checking every corner of the lookout and marking any anomalies. That's when I discovered the first real warning. Etched into the wooden floorboards were scratches, forming a pattern that resembled a distorted handprint. Nearby, a note written in an almost illegible scrawl read, "Do not answer, do not follow." My pulse quickened. Whoever or whatever had left this had done so for me. Even mundane tasks became exercises in tension. I prepared breakfast, but each clang of the pan against the counter sounded unnaturally loud, echoing through the tower as if the forest were listening. Outside, the sunlight danced through the trees, but shadows formed where none should exist, long and jagged, stretching unnaturally across the ground. By midday, I was convinced the forest had its own rhythm, a heartbeat that pulsed beneath the surface. I stepped carefully along the worn path to check the surrounding perimeter, noticing shapes in the underbrush, faint humanoid figures that vanished whenever I blinked or looked directly at them. Their presence was subtle, a flicker at the edge of perception, yet impossible to ignore. They moved with purpose, and I realized with a shiver that the forest was no passive backdrop. It was alive, conscious, and increasingly hostile. A local hiker appeared on the trail unexpectedly, an old man with a wiry frame and eyes sharp as flint. He nodded toward me without greeting. "You'll see it soon," he said, voice low, almost trembling. "Pay attention to the marks. Respect the rules, they're not suggestions. This place, it changes if you don't listen." He shuffled off before I could respond, leaving me with a growing sense of dread. The remainder of the day passed in tense vigilance. Every glance out the window revealed slight alterations. A tree that I had noted earlier now seemed angled differently. A rock that had been part of the path now lay partially buried in moss, as if moved deliberately. And always, the whispers lingered, soft, almost inaudible at first, rising in frequency and intensity whenever I strayed from the path or neglected to check my surroundings. Even Harris seemed affected, quieter than usual, almost haunted. He moved with deliberate caution, never lingering outside the tower, and occasionally glancing over his shoulder as if expecting something to leap from the shadows. When I asked him about it, he merely shook his head. "They adapt," he said. "Everything you do is watched. Learn the rules, or be consumed by them." That night, the signs became undeniable. I was reviewing old notes from previous volunteers when I heard a loud crash outside. Running to the window, I saw a humanoid shape, grotesque and shifting, moving just beyond the tree line. The figure seemed to flicker in and out of existence, its form adapting as though aware of my gaze. I stumbled back, heart racing, realizing that the forest's intelligence was not theoretical, it was active, observing, evolving. With every action I took, I began to leave my own marks, hoping to guide or confuse the entity, to understand it. I etched small symbols in the dirt, placed objects in deliberate positions, and spoke aloud, following Harris's guidance. Yet with each step, the forest seemed to anticipate, adjusting paths, manipulating shadows, and producing sounds designed to unsettle. It was not merely a test, it was a predator learning to hunt. By the end of the night, I was exhausted and terrified, but also a little more aware. The forest left traces of its presence everywhere, distorted animal tracks that led nowhere, whispers forming coherent sentences if listened to carefully, and glimpses of figures at the periphery of vision that would vanish upon direct focus. It was teaching me, reminding me that every rule existed to preserve life, and every broken boundary had consequences far greater than I had yet experienced. Lying awake, listening to the forest breathing and shifting around the tower, I understood the terrifying reality. I was not just in a forest. I was inside the mind of something ancient and intelligent, and it had already begun to anticipate my every move. Survival would not be a matter of strength or endurance. It would be a matter of respect, of precision, and of learning to obey rules I had only begun to understand. And I knew, with a sinking certainty, that the entity had marked me, and that the next mistake would be far worse. The forest had begun to feel like a living labyrinth, one that shifted subtly with every breath I took. Each morning brought new distortions. Trees that had stood in one place now leaned at impossible angles. Moss-covered stones rearranged themselves along the trails, and the air itself seemed thicker, almost viscous, pressing against skin and lungs alike. I had learned to respect the rules, the mantra that had guided me through the first weeks. But a restless curiosity gnawed at me. I wanted to understand, not just survive. It started with the signs. Cryptic symbols carved into trees, remnants of warnings from volunteers long vanished, beckoned from deeper in the forest. Each mark felt deliberate, almost insistent, as if the forests were urging me to cross boundaries that should have remained sacred. Harris warned me once, voice tight with tension. "Those marks are not for you. Do not follow them. Never break the rules." I nodded, but something in me recoiled against blind obedience. Knowledge felt more urgent than safety. The third rule, ignore warning signs, loomed in my mind. It was meant to be simple, a matter of survival, yet the forest's patterns were intoxicating. One evening, while mapping the area near the tower, I noticed a series of unusual carvings along an old oak. Each symbol seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light, as if breathing. Against every instinct, I pressed closer, tracing them with my fingertips. The air around the tree thickened, smelled of damp earth and something metallic, and I felt a subtle hum vibrating through the soles of my feet. It began as a whisper, a soft suggestion that escalated into coherent words. "Come, learn, understand." My rational mind screamed that this was the third rule, that obeying meant certain safety, that breaking it could mean death. But the whisper was seductive, filled with the weight of knowledge, and I felt drawn into the forest, as though by invisible hands. I took a step, and then another, and the forest seemed to sigh, exhaling darkness that wrapped around me like a cloak. The trees shifted, almost imperceptibly, but enough to disorient me. A familiar trail now twisted in impossible ways. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, stretching toward me with deliberate intent. Shapes that had always lingered at the edge of vision now moved closer, their forms more defined and grotesque. I could see figures that resembled people I knew, their faces distorted, their mouths opening in silent screams. I realized, with cold clarity, that the forest was alive, not just in body but in mind, adapting to my every thought, anticipating my actions. I pressed on, following the symbols, until I reached a clearing that seemed untouched by time, yet entirely alien. The air here was thick with decay, and an electric hum that made my skin prickle. Faint light filtered from a sky that seemed darker than night, and in the center stood an entity I could barely comprehend. It was not a creature in any conventional sense. It was a mass of shadows that shifted and writhed, absorbing the forest around it, reflecting my deepest fears. Its presence pressed into my chest, a weight that made each breath a conscious effort. I froze. The whispering voice returned, now layered and insistent, echoing with the tones of every person I had known, every friend, mentor, and stranger. "Do you understand yet? Do you see the rules? You cannot control this. You cannot leave. You must obey, or become nothing." The forest around me reacted violently to hesitation. Branches curled like serpents, reaching toward me, leaves scraping my face and arms as though trying to pull me into the shadows. Panic surged, but rational thought clung stubbornly. The third rule was clear: never ignore warning signs. Yet, had ignored them, the forest had tested me, and I had failed. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet every step I had taken had been anticipated. The entity shifted, folding space in impossible ways. The clearing expanded, contracted, and twisted, disorienting me. I felt as if I were suspended in a nightmare that had no ceiling or floor, where the sky was molten shadow and the ground wriggled like living flesh. I stumbled backward, trying to retrace my steps, but the path had vanished. The symbols I had followed now glowed faintly, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed alive. The whispering grew louder, repeating phrases I could not fully comprehend, yet felt intrinsically terrifying. The shadows in the forest began to take on more aggressive shapes, reaching out with limbs that seemed simultaneously tangible and insubstantial. I realized, with a sinking dread, that the entity was not stationary. It had followed me, learning the nuances of my behavior. The forest around me reacted in real time, adapting to my movements, predicting my attempts at evasion. Every misstep, every hesitation, amplified the danger. And then I understood. The rules were not arbitrary. They were shields, delicate barriers between survival and annihilation. Breaking even one had allowed this intelligence to probe, to test, to anticipate. A sound like shattering glass echoed across the clearing, and I was thrown to the ground. Shadows surged over me, cold and viscous, as if trying to absorb not just my body, but my very essence. I pressed my palms against the forest floor, tasting the iron tang of soil and blood, grounding myself with the smallest of physical truths. The entity responded, folding the shadows back slightly, as though it respected the act of self-preservation, but only minimally. I forced myself to move deliberately, step by step, adhering as closely as possible to the remaining rules. The forest shifted with me, testing every move. One wrong turn, and I would have been swallowed entirely. I focused on tactile and auditory cues, marking branches with scratches, counting steps between markers, listening for subtle changes in the hum of the air. Every sense was heightened. Every sound and texture had meaning. Survival had become a meticulous dance, performed under the scrutiny of an intelligence older and more cunning than I could fathom. Hours or, perhaps, only minutes passed in this nightmarish stasis. The clearing seemed infinite, the shadows, almost sentient, reacting with cruel precision to my every thought. I could no longer trust sight alone. My mind and body had to cooperate fully to navigate the shifting maze. And then, as if responding to the smallest act of obedience, the forest loosened its grip slightly. The shadows receded just enough to allow a narrow path, marked by the very symbols that had drawn me here. Leading back toward the tower, I moved quickly but carefully, retracing my steps, every nerve alive with terror and relief. The forest had tested me, and I had survived, barely. The third rule had been broken, and the consequences had been immediate and brutal. Yet in surviving, I understood the rules in a way I never had before. They were not mere guidelines. They were contracts, agreements between myself and an intelligence that demanded absolute respect. When I finally collapsed onto the floor of the tower, gasping and trembling, Harris looked at me with quiet intensity. He did not ask what had happened. No words were necessary. I understood now that the forest's mind had marked me, had learned me, and would remember every misstep. The consequences of disobedience were not just immediate, they were cumulative, shaping the very way the forest interacted with me from that moment onward. I vowed silently that I would follow the rules perfectly from then on. There was no room for curiosity, no room for hesitation, no room for error. The forest had made its intelligence clear, and I had no illusions about my place within it. Every step, every breath, every action would be measured, precise, and deliberate. Survival depended entirely on this rigid adherence, and I understood that any future deviations would not be met with mercy. Yet even in this resolution, a part of me trembled. The entity had adapted to my behavior, demonstrating a cunning that I could scarcely comprehend. I could not predict its next move, could not foresee its strategies. I had survived, yes, but only by the slimmest margin, and the forest would not. Forget. The third rule, once broken, had altered the terms of my existence within this living, breathing labyrinth. The forest's intelligence was no longer theoretical, it was active, calculating, and endlessly patient. And so I waited, knowing that the forest would continue to watch, to learn, to test. Every shadow was a question, every whisper a probe, every shifted branch a warning. I had glimpsed the consequences of breaking a rule, and I understood that the stakes had only grown higher. Obedience was no longer optional. It was the difference between life and an unimaginable, unending consumption. After surviving the confrontation with the forest and the entity, I had learned to move with caution, measuring every step, listening for the slightest shift in air or shadow. The tower, once a refuge, now felt more like a fragile bubble, barely holding against the living labyrinth that surrounded it. I knew I could not endure this ordeal alone. Yet the forest had already shown me how deceptive appearances could be. Trust was a dangerous currency, and every gesture, every word from those around me had to be weighed carefully. Harris remained a steady presence, his grizzled face and weary eyes betraying a lifetime spent under the forest's scrutiny. He rarely spoke of his own experiences, only offering guidance when absolutely necessary. Not everyone who offers help is sincere, he had warned, his tone clipped and wary. This forest will tempt them as easily as it tempts you. Keep your mind sharp and your eyes sharper. I nodded, trying to absorb the weight of his advice, yet I felt the pressing need for allies, for some human connection in this relentless, shifting wilderness. Then there was Lila, a volunteer who had arrived just days before the disturbances escalated. She was younger, more reckless than Harris, and carried a quiet intensity that suggested both determination and fear. She approached me one morning with a mixture of hope and desperation. "I think we can help each other," she said, eyes scanning the tree line as if the forest itself might overhear. "I've been observing patterns, and I think if we work together, we can survive longer." At first, I welcomed her assistance. Having someone to share the burden, someone to witness and corroborate the strange events, offered a fleeting sense of safety. Together, we mapped the tower's perimeter, recorded the shifting paths, and documented the symbols that the forest had left in its wake. Yet, even as we worked, a subtle tension simmered beneath our cooperation. I could sense her unease, the flicker of doubt in her eyes whenever shadows moved too deliberately, whenever whispers emerged from the darkness. The forest, of course, noticed our collaboration. Its presence pressed against us more keenly, shadows following our steps, whispers forming coherent sentences, aimed to undermine our trust. "You cannot rely on each other," the voice said one night, mimicking Harris's gruff tone but twisted, mocking. I glanced at Lila, whose eyes reflected the same creeping paranoia I felt, and for a moment I wondered whether the forest had planted the seed of doubt deliberately, an invisible hand pulling at the threads of our fragile alliance. Then came the betrayal. It began subtly, small mistakes, suggestions that contradicted one another, and paths we had carefully charted suddenly leading into dead ends or dangerous clearings. One evening, while checking markers near the edge of the forest, I noticed Lila moving toward an unmarked trailer route I had specifically warned her against. "That's dangerous," I called, but she only smiled faintly, a strange, almost foreign expression. "I need to know," she whispered. "I can't live in fear forever." I knew immediately something was wrong. The forest had always tested compliance, and her disregard for my warnings felt like a deliberate alignment with the entity's men. Shadows moved closer as she advanced, and the trees seemed to shift subtly, guiding her steps into places I would have never entered. I tried to call her back, but the whispers had already altered perception, bending reality, and even my voice sounded distant and hollow. Harris appeared behind me just then, his expression grim. "She's not herself," he said, eyes narrowing as if seeing beyond the visible. "The forest preys on what it can't reach directly. It manipulates, tempts, and turns allies into instruments of its will." We watched as Lila disappeared into the tree line, her figure dissolving into the shadows until she was indistinguishable from the forest itself. The whispers that followed were unmistakable. "The rules are fragile. Obedience is optional. Betrayal is inevitable." The weight of isolation hit me with renewed force. Trust was no longer a possibility. Every interaction, every gesture, every human presence had become a potential trap. And yet, I could not abandon all hope. Harris remained a cautious ally, but even his loyalty carried a palpable tension, a constant questioning of motives and decisions. We had survived together thus far, but the forest was learning, adapting, and it seemed intent on testing every bond we held. It became clear that the rules were not merely for survival, they were tools for navigating a psychological battlefield. The forest exploited weakness, fear, and desire, using shadows, whispers, and spectral visions to fracture alliances. Every volunteer's history, every decision, became data for the entity, shaping its responses and predictions. Obedience had to be absolute, not just to survive the entity's immediate wrath, but to prevent the erosion of trust among those who might aid us. The forest itself seemed to pulse with intelligence, observing and cataloging behavior. Trees shifted to block paths, creating false trails that lured one into danger, while others opened corridors that were deceptively safe. Shadows formed shapes that mirrored friends or foes, testing reactions and loyalty. It was no longer just a physical challenge, it was psychological, probing not only my fears but my capacity to judge character and intent. Harris and I redoubled our efforts, relying on a mix of observation, intuition, and meticulous adherence to the rules. We marked paths with subtle signs only we could interpret, communicated in whispers that the forest could not fully decode, and rehearsed scenarios in which we might need to act independently while still maintaining coordinated strategies. Each day, the tension built, a constant pressure that left us exhausted yet hyper-aware. Yet even as we reinforced our defenses, the reality of betrayal lingered. Lila's disappearance was a stark reminder that alliances were fragile, that the forest's intelligence extended beyond mere manipulation of space and sound. It could manipulate trust, turn cooperation into conflict, and exploit emotional bonds to create chaos. Every shadow, every whisper, every subtle movement of foliage could conceal an instrument of betrayal, a trap waiting to unfold at the slightest misstep. The forest's lesson was clear. Survival required more than adherence to rules. It demanded vigilance, discernment, and an almost preternatural awareness of human behavior under duress. Each day became an exercise in psychological endurance, a test not only of obedience but of insight into the intentions of those around me. Harris and I relied on quiet observation, noting inconsistencies in behavior, subtle hesitation in speech, and the faintest signs of deception. Knowing that the forest was always watching, always learning. Even now, I felt the subtle presence of Leela's influence lingering, a ghostly echo in the trees and shadows. Was she truly gone, or had the forest corrupted her in ways I could not detect? Could any ally ever be fully trusted again, or was every interaction now a potential trap, every voice a possible instrument of manipulation? The questions haunted me as I moved through the forest, forcing me to treat every gesture, every whisper, every shift in shadow with calculated caution. In the end, the forest had not merely tested obedience, it had tested loyalty, trust, and the fragile bonds that allowed humans to cooperate in the face of danger. Betrayal was not just a consequence of fear or desperation. It was a weapon, wielded subtly, invisibly, by an intelligence that adapted faster than any human mind could anticipate. The lesson was harsh, but unavoidable. Alliances could save or doom us, and the forest would exploit every flaw, every hesitation, every lapse in judgment. As night fell, the whispers returned, now interwoven with fragments of voices I had trusted, warnings that twisted into threats. The shadows shifted with purpose, testing our reactions, probing for weaknesses, seeking to fracture the alliance that remained. Harris and I huddled near the tower, silent and vigilant, knowing that the forest's trials were far from over. Each day would demand greater scrutiny, sharper instincts, and unwavering adherence to the rules, not only for survival, but for the fragile hope that an ally might yet be genuine. The forest had become both adversary and teacher, its intelligence undeniable, its patience every shadow, every whisper, every shift in the labyrinthine paths carried meaning, a lesson in survival that transcended simple obedience. And in this relentless environment, one truth was inescapable. Trust was a rare and dangerous commodity, and betrayal, whether born of human weakness or the forest's manipulation, could come at any moment, with consequences more devastating than the darkness itself. The forest had grown bolder. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, branches arched like twisted fingers, and the whispers no longer hesitated at the edges of perception. They filled the air, overlapping, repeating, mocking. Each sound felt calculated, a precise attempt to disorient, to wear down my senses, until I could no longer distinguish between the real and the imagined. I had spent the morning scanning the perimeter, checking markers, and reaffirming my path with meticulous care. Harris moved beside me silently, his eyes sharp, scanning every tree line, every flicker of movement, every hint of an unnatural shift in the wind. Despite the precautions, the tension was palpable, pressing down like humid, oppressive air. We knew the forest had learned from our previous encounters, that it had adapted, and that any misstep could be fatal. It began as a subtle change, the wind carrying fragments of familiar voices, stitched together into sentences that seemed to call my name. They whispered doubts, regrets, memories, twisting reality like threads in a loom. I froze at one point, hearing my own voice, distorted and